actually, I ought to know him better because I wrote another piece for the Times about, I'm Matthew Taylor, by the way. Well, no, you invited me up, so, and look, it's getting late, so I just thought I'd get, would you want to, no, please, shall I, no. Carry on. But there are so many achievements that you might want to share with the room. And Ed just told me to use my best joke as well, the Wonder Zone joke, so I can't use that. No, I wrote a piece for the Times a couple of years ago about the CBI dinner. Actually, it's about 4 or 5 years ago, which is the most hideous event you can possibly go to. It features entirely kind of middle-aged men sitting at tables, and the speeches are all from business people saying how wonderful business is. And also where you sit depends on how much money you pay. So if you've paid a lot of money for your table, you're right next to the stage. If you haven't paid much at all, you're kind of on the balcony, 200 yards away. So it kind of sums up everything that's wrong with British business: complacency, male domination, and everything else. Anyway, I wrote this article about this, saying this, which the Times promised me would go in the day after the CBI dinner, but it went in the day of the CBI dinner, which I was actually invited to. I later found out that Tony, it was just before I went to work with Tony Blair, but people knew that I knew him, that he was the speaker, the main speaker that night, and he went in and Digby Jones said to him, have you read this article, this, who is this Matthew Taylor? And Tony replied that he'd never heard of me. Is there any water? Great. Right, so I've changed my speech because I kind of realized that you've had all sorts of really fantastic speakers, and I was going to do a really brilliantly fascinating speech about neuroscience, behavioral economics, social psychology, and all the really clever stuff that I know. But I decided it's kind of quite late in the day, and also you've got tea with David Willits apparently, so you're all going to be kind of like chomping at the bit, I know, for that. So I'm going to be, I got kind of distracted also yesterday because I was thinking about this new speech, which is a speech I'm going to give to you when I finally get round to it, and I got kind of distracted by watching a football match, and it reminded me of my favourite family joke, actually, which I'm just going to share with you because it was late in the afternoon, which is about the woman who's a mad Liverpool supporter. So the house is called The Cop, the twin boys are called Jamie and Stevie, the dog's called Rafa, and she's completely obsessed by Liverpool. And eventually her poor husband, who has had put up with this for years and years and years, in the middle of an argument turns to her and says, or battling through the tears almost, says, sometimes, he says to her, sometimes I think that you love Liverpool more than you love me. Listen, she says, I love Everton more than I love you. The funny thing about that joke is it's normally told the other way around in gender, and if you tell it the other way around in gender, it's really offensive and people don't laugh. Now, a glance at the FPI website, I was looking at it yesterday. I mean, it is quite amazing how far the parenting and family kind of movement has gone in the last decade. I mean, it really is a remarkable shift. It reflects kind of major social trends. I'm not going to go through those. You know them. The challenging world that parents face, changes in the labour market, the growing importance of education, the impact of mass culture and new technology. It reflects the diversity of forms of parenting, changing social norms, also reflects the diversity of society. I also think this increasing emphasis on family is to do with a recognition that traditional tools to tackle social injustice haven't worked, and a growing emphasis on the importance of the early years as a strategy to overcome social inequality. There's also been a different element to this debate, which has been about an emphasis on behaviour. Frank Field always says that 30 years ago people used to come to his surgeries to complain about the council, now they come to his surgeries to complain about other people. And so this emphasis on behaviour, a kind of emerging new moralism, which is also feeding into the debate about families. And then finally, perhaps more recently in the last 3 or 4 years, growing concern about children's physical and mental well-being, as well as kind of the simple statistics of social inequality. So these are all kind of major social trends that have driven families to the centre of the debate. And I don't think any of that's going to change. And if you look at the family policy, I think what you can say is that we're now talking about a new pillar of the welfare state, a pillar that involves universal entitlements around, for example, parental leave, that's around provision of services, not just Sure Start and children's centres, but all kinds of other services, an increasing emphasis on parents and family in other areas of public policy, whether in a positive sense it's about schools engaging with parents, or in a less positive sense, it's about parenting orders in the criminal justice system. And then also the emergence of new institutions, the Children's Commission and the National Academy for Parenting Practitioners. So a new pillar to the welfare state. So what I want to talk about is a question about what happens when this kind of family and parenting movement has reached a particular stage. What kind of movement are you? What kind of choices do you face as a movement? And this kind of obsesses me slightly because the thing that really interests me is kind of political campaigning, political movement. I used to have a little hobby of collecting the worst examples of inept political campaigning that I'd ever seen in my long and moderately successful life. I'll just share these with you because there's a lot of pain involved in them for me. My favourite example from 20 years of working in the Labour Party was a Labour Party meeting I went to when I was kind of so overwhelmed with misery about the kind of awful nature of this meeting that I said to the person who was running the meeting, I said, why don't we ever talk about new members at our meetings? And he said, and I quote, he said, no, we never really bother with new members because we found they only ever come to one meeting. So I've got two more examples of this, actually. The second one I love, used to live in Leamington Spa in the 1980s, and Leamington Spa was full of kind of goths, and everyone used to be, there were people who dressed in black, and they'd have kind of dogs on bits of string and things like that. And there was kind of a big vegetarian movement. Lots of vegetarians, and but they had a kind of massive issue about halal butcher's shop in Leamington Spa. The kind of, you can imagine the kind of difficult politics of all of this because then you're opposed to ritual slaughter, but on the other hand, and they resolved this famously by one day a friend of mine who was actually a halal butcher came into his shop and a brick had been thrown through the plate glass window of the shop, and he got to the brick, distraught, but got the brick. Wrapped around the brick was a piece of paper on which was scrawled in crayon, "This is not a racist attack." Which I thought was which was very comforting to him, actually. But my favourite example, which you've probably heard, but it's still fantastic, is that the Association of University Teachers in the 1970s, they'd never ever done anything, really, in terms of campaigning. But in the middle of that time, when, if you remember, there was all sorts, well, if you're old like me, you remember, there were all sorts of kind of constraints on public sector pay. And so they decided for the first time, the Association of University Teachers, that they were going to have a national demonstration. So all these dons came to town, encouraged to wear their gowns and boards and all this kind of stuff, to march through the streets arguing for better academic pay. And they formed a committee which met for several weeks to decide how to organise this conference. One of the big issues was, what should their slogan be? And they worked on it, and they worked on it. Eventually, they produced their slogan, which was on every single placard as they walked down Whitehall. And the slogan that they chose to engage people like bus drivers and taxi drivers and the general public was just 3 words. It was "rectify the anomaly." Which I'm sure kind of really, tapped into a kind of massive tide of working class solidarity. So look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss with you briefly, really, 6 kind of questions that I think movements have to ask themselves, and they're not issues that ever get resolved. They're dilemmas, they're constant dilemmas, but they're really quite important. And I'm not suggesting to you today that you resolve them. I'm suggesting to you that you need to keep thinking about them and keep talking about them. So the first one is simply this: it's pessimism versus optimism. Is your core message, is the core message of the family and parenting movement that things are getting better, but they could be getting even better, or is your message that things are absolutely terrible and getting worse? Now, that might just be a reflection of your genetic predisposition, by the way. There's more and more neuroscience work that suggests that one of the fundamental differences between people is whether or not they're born happy or sad, with a kind of, an inclination to happiness. And that's regardless, actually, of your parenting. There's just a kind of, some people are born more likely to be optimistic, others more likely to be pessimistic. But regardless of your kind of personal characteristics, I think that's an important choice to make. So you could, if you wanted to, and as many people do, you could bang on about the UNICEF report, and you could say that Britain is the worst place to live in the world, and it's absolutely terrible, and every single child is completely is obese and depressed, and their lives are falling apart, only torn away from the horrors of the internet to eat a donut. On the other hand, you might say that children's health has improved, that children's educational attainment has improved, that there are many more sporting and cultural opportunities in schools, that child poverty, although not down as much as we want, is down, that there's much more parental engagement in schools. You might be celebrating, as I think you have been today in, kind of, in some of your research, the growing role that fathers are playing in family life. Now, there's no resolution to this. What I would say is this. I'd say the best story is to say, look at what families are achieving in a challenging time, and how can we help every family achieve as much as most families are achieving. But getting that balance is really light, because although pessimism is kind of more appealing, people do turn off, you know, you listen to the Today programme, you know, there is a kind of point where you just want to hear it anymore, and somebody who comes along and says something positive and then attaches to it a kind of agenda for change, I think gets listened to more. So, optimism, pessimism, that's the first kind of challenge. The second challenge is this, which is for a lot of movements, including yours, is your focus on the needs of all parents and families, or are you simply concerned with the needs of the most disadvantaged? And that is a really difficult challenge. It's not clear to me. Maybe that's something you've resolved today. I don't know. But it seems to be a really big question. And it is, you know, it's genuine dilemma in welfare policy. One of the things I learned when I was in government is that there's a core dilemma at the heart of welfare policy, which is, it's called it's a trilemma. There are three things. You can do 2 out of 3, but you can never do all 3 in welfare policy. You can provide incentives to everybody. You can target the poor, or you can save money, but you can do 2 of those 3, but you can never do all 3. So there are genuine choices in policy about universalism versus targeting in the context of limited resources. And I guess, what is the answer to that? Well, I think you have to have a message for all families in order that you're not kind of placed in a particular box in relation to the constituency that you're concerned about. And maybe it's understanding what makes every family work, whatever its form, that helps us to understand what's missing in disadvantaged families and helps legitimize the call for investment and support in those families. So balancing the conversation you have about what every single family needs means that you can then have a more powerful message about how those things that we all agree every family needs are missing in some most disadvantaged and damaged families, and what we can do to help those families. The third dilemma, I think, particularly for you, is this: are we working towards a single account of what's best for children? And if we are, how do we balance that account of what's best for children with the need for tolerance, for respecting difference, and for engaging with people whatever the reality of their lives? So we saw a lot of attention the other day for the Demos report, which argued for a particular form of parenting, tough love parenting, based on a great deal of research. And there is going to be more and more scope to be kind of technocratic about parenting. There'll be many more statistics giving us longitudinal studies which seem to indicate what works. There'll be neuroscience and other bits of research that will seem to suggest to us the one best way of doing things. But there is a danger associated with that. There's a danger of being incredibly deterministic and intrusive as well. Somehow in our work, we have to recognize our argument needs to be that children can survive terrible things and thrive, but the question is not whether they can, it's whether they should have to. And I think in our communications, in the way in which we talk about our work, we need to be celebrating the different ways in which families cope and thrive, not just celebrating one particular way of doing it, if we're not going to appear to be a kind of a rather overbearing, deterministic and paternalistic kind of movement. So there are lots and lots of different ways in which families succeed, and we should be celebrating those many different ways. At the same time, as being aware of the research which tells us what can be most effective. The fourth question, so I'm halfway through, you'll be relieved to hear. David Willits is waiting for you with a cupcake outside. And what a vision that is. The fourth question is the focus of our campaign in government or society? Now, I think this is a really, really important question for all organisations, quangos and third sector organisations. It's incredibly easy to get sucked into thinking that what you should do is focus entirely on government spending and government regulation and move into what I call a kind of government-centric account of the world that would say if only government gave us more money, did more regulation, banned a few more things, then everything would be absolutely fine. And I think that that's a mistake, because most of the dilemmas we face as a society are social dilemmas. They're issues about how we, all of us, manage our lives, how we deal with our differences, how we weigh up our priorities. And there's two different dimensions to this argument. The first is that government can only do what the public allows the government to do, and so how we shape the public debate is crucial. And you just had the question about safeguarding. Now, politicians, as we all know, are in a completely impossible position in this regard, because if they are seen in any way to be allowing any possibility of risk for children, then they know they're absolutely going to get dumped on by, journalists. If, on the other hand, they put in place measures to try to minimize risks, they then get accused of, all the stuff they've been accused of in the last few weeks in terms of putting off parents and creating a kind of a regulatory state. Now, who is going to have the grown-up debate about risk with parents? I can tell you at the moment it's not going to be politicians, because politicians are not, generally speaking, allowed to have much of a grown-up debate, because what they say is mediated through the media. So in that area, that's an example of where it is that a movement like this needs to foster that debate, needs to identify false, impossible dilemmas like that, and have a grown-up conversation about the fact that unless we accept a certain amount of risk, we're going to end up in an incredibly kind of controlled and bureaucratic environment in terms of working with children, to take that example. The other point, in terms of whether you focus campaigning activity on government or society, is to recognise there's a question about employers. I mean, yes, we can ask government to do something with employers, we can ask government to get tough with employers, but also we as a movement ourselves need to engage with employers. And we have to engage with civil society. When I used to work in Number 10, I used to make a distinction between two different kinds of people. There was one group of people who would come to me with kind of chewed up newspaper articles, and they'd stuff them in my ear to tell me how awful the world was and how I ought to change everything and how government should change everything and blah, 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 blah. And I would kind of listen to them, and then they'd go. And then there was another group of people who come to me and they'd say, this is something that we're doing. We are innovating. We are making a difference in our community, in our locality, through our organisation, and we've achieved something. What government can now do is help us, support us in doing more of it, or take barriers away. And I listen to those people incredibly intently. So it is important that this remains, that this is a movement which is as much focused on working with society, speaking to society, engaging with society. It doesn't get caught in the idea that the only things that ever matter are things which emanate from Whitehall. I mean, ultimately, ministers will only do what the public allows them to do. So if you're not shaping the public debate, in the end, you'll find that you're not a terribly effective influencer of government either. Okay, two final points. The fifth point is about professionalism. Professionalism versus professionalisation. Now, I think it's a very interesting question for the family and parent movement. Is it a movement of professionals or a movement of citizens? Are you more like, I could ask you this question, if any, but I might find out half of you are asleep, but are you more like the National Association of Head Teachers or more like net mums? Now, I think it's a really interesting question, because on the one hand, of course you want to professionalise, and the whole day has been about looking at research and deepening your knowledge and using words like epi-research, which is a fantastic word. I'm going to use that a lot more, epi-research. If I have a daughter, I might even call her epi-research. It's a great name. Anyway, but yes, developing kind of professional expertise and knowledge and building up that body of expertise is really, really important. But you know the danger that exists. And the danger is what's happened in the education world. I mean, I'm an educational progressive, and I go around to conferences of teachers' organisations. I was at the NEHT, actually, funnily enough, a few weeks ago. And Mick Brooks, who runs the NEHT, is a lovely guy, and he said, I was talking about the kind of progressive agenda. And he said, well, of course, everybody agrees with this. And I said, no, Mick, everybody that you speak to agrees with this. Most parents, most people, they think what's going on in schools is kind of terrible. They don't understand. If you said capabilities-based curriculum, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. That all people who are kind of less progressive in their outlook have to do is describe a lot of things that go on in school. And it's a kind of mystery to many people. The whole education community, professional education community, talks in this sort of bizarre, distancing language. And it's even weirder when you think that teachers are parents. But they still talk in this kind of weird language that parents can't, generally speaking, relate to. So the fifth dilemma, I don't know the answer to this, is to find a way of gaining your credibility as a professional movement that has a body of knowledge and insight and skills and qualifications without distancing yourselves from ordinary parents and, in terms of the language that you use. And then there's a final point. Great, so I'm on target. And this final point is this. Are we making a special case for families with young children, with young children in particular? Or are we part of a broader discussion about well-being in society? What is the biggest challenge facing society? Probably, in terms of public spending, it's demographic change. So is our strategy to say what we've got to do is we've got to fight to defend the budgets of families with young children, of provision for children, provision for families, against the danger that more of that money gets sucked into dealing with the issues of demography? Or do we instead, and it's obvious what I'm recommending here, or do we instead say what we need to do is to have a collaboration with organisations representing older people to talk about families in a much broader, more general sense? Is our analysis fundamentally that successful families are part of a successful society? Now, of course, as a movement, you will have cases that you want to make, arguments you want to make. You will want to emphasise the early years, but I think it's also an incredibly important characteristic of different kinds of movement, whether or not they collaborate and they try to build a broader argument about the kind of society they want, or whether in a sense they always seem as though they're fighting for their particular slice of the cake. Now, it seems to me that, and this is a different speech, I'm just ending on this so that if you think I've been good, you can book me again. I'm very, very reasonable. And I've not got, and also all my public sector bookings have dried up since I wrote that piece in the Times, so I'm getting slightly desperate. But there's a kind of bigger speech that I could give you about where it is I think society is currently poised, and I'll do that. Actually, it's an entire theory of the world, and I'm going to do it in 90 seconds, okay? So here we go. I talked a bit about neuroscience. It seems to be one of the ways of understanding the dilemmas facing humanity in a country like ours is that we are trying to deal with the modern world with prehistoric brains. That is to say, the circumstances of human beings have changed fundamentally in the last 50 years, and even more dramatically in the last 10 years, and probably even more dramatically in the 10 years to come. And we're trying to deal with that with this kind of machinery that evolved for hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years in some ways, in a different set of circumstances. And there were three particular transitions that we're on. For nearly all of our evolution, we did not live in a time of abundance. We lived in a time of scarcity. So how do we cope with abundance? So when you look around society, whether it's obesity or loneliness or all sorts of other things, we're finding it hard to cope with abundance, plenty. Secondly, we've gone from being people who lived in very slow-moving, very deferential societies that worship nature gods or sky gods or monarchs, and we're now incredibly kind of skeptical, cynical. We don't believe in our belief in authority has collapsed in many ways. And then thirdly, nearly all our evolution, we lived with people just like ourselves. We lived in homogeneous, closed communities. And now suddenly we live in this kind of diverse, fast-changing, 24-hour media, global village. Now, I think in all of those three dimensions, over the next 50 years, we will achieve a transition. We will be people who have moved through this kind of period of not being able to cope with abundance to a much rounder account of human fulfillment. And I think you can see lots of elements of society that suggest we're starting to have that conversation. I think we'll move from being people who are, at the moment, we're people who are not who are unwilling to be governed, but not yet willing to govern ourselves. But I think we will move to being people who are more intelligent citizens in terms of democracy and managing our own lives. And then thirdly, I think that we will thrive in the diversity of society, but at the moment we're often stuck in those places. So it's a very difficult, interesting time for humanity. Some people have characterized this moment in society's development as being the teenage years of Enlightenment man, and as those Enlightenment person. And those of you who have teenage kids will know it's a time of kind of immense power and creativity, but it's also kind of time of self-indulgence and and vague hysteria. So that's kind of where we are as a society. So at a time like this, an emphasis on families and parents is incredibly important. I think everybody in the room who's part of what has been achieved in the last few years should feel incredibly proud. A conference like this just would not have been possible 10 years ago. The kind of quality of research analysis that you've got. But as a movement, you've also got responsibilities. And I suppose what I've been saying to you this afternoon briefly is that it's important that as a group of people, we continue to be open and self-critical about the ways in which we work. Because society needs a lot of things from the family and parenting movement, but most of all, it needs us to be honest, intelligent, and to go back to my first point, it needs us to be optimistic. Thank you.